A racist doctor dismisses a black patient seeking urgent care only to discover he's the most powerful figure in the healthcare system. What happens next will leave everyone questioning their assumptions and beliefs. The hospital buzzed with life as the day began, its sterile white walls gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. Dr. Richard Coleman strode through the corridors with practiced precision. His crisp white coat swayed slightly as he walked, his name embroidered neatly above the pocket, a mark of authority, of importance. Patients and staff alike watched him pass. Some greeted him with polite nods, others with hesitant smiles. He barely acknowledged them. To him, this was routine, a world where his word was final and his talent unquestionable. Richard was skilled, undeniably so. His diagnosis was sharp, his hand steady in surgery. People said he had a gift, but Richard believed it was more. Discipline, intelligence, hard work. Qualities he thought few possessed. Qualities he prided himself on, sometimes too much. Yet beneath the polished surface lay something darker, a quiet but persistent prejudice. It lingered in the way he avoided certain patients' eyes, the way his tone turned curt with those who didn't fit his idea of worthy. This morning was no different. As he scanned the day's schedule, his lips tightened at the sight of an unfamiliar name. Probably another waste of my time, he thought, his judgment cast before the patient even arrived. The sliding doors of the hospital parted smoothly as John Davis stepped inside. His presence was understated yet commanding. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer and crisp white shirt, he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His polished shoes clicked softly against the tiled floor, contrasting with the chaotic hum of the bustling lobby. John's expression was calm, almost serene, though his sharp eyes took in every detail around him. He approached the reception desk with measured steps, nodding politely to a nurse who hurried past. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice warm but firm. "I have an urgent matter to attend to. Could you direct me to the appropriate department?" The receptionist glanced up, momentarily taken aback by his composure. She fumbled briefly before pointing him toward the waiting area. "Thank you," John replied, flashing a polite smile before taking a seat, exuding patience despite the urgency. John Davis stood still for a moment, absorbing the doctor's dismissive tone. His expression didn't falter, calm and composed as ever. He adjusted the cuff of his blazer, a small, deliberate movement, before meeting Dr. Coleman's turned back. "Understood," John said evenly, his voice carrying just enough weight to make heads turn. "I'll seek care elsewhere." He stepped away from the desk, his polished shoes echoing faintly against the tiled floor. A few nurses exchanged uneasy glances. The tension was thick, unspoken but palpable. One of them opened her mouth, as if to say something, but stopped, her gaze shifting nervously toward Dr. Coleman. John paused at the exit, turning slightly toward the room. "I do have an important meeting later today," he said, his tone polite, but with a sharp edge that lingered just long enough. "I hope your day improves, Doctor." The sliding doors closed behind him with a soft whoosh, and the lobby felt heavier in his absence. A young nurse exhaled audibly. "That didn't feel right," she murmured to her colleague. "Shay," the other replied, her eyes darting to Dr. Coleman, who was already busying himself with another chart, ignoring the quiet storm he had just created. The hospital hummed with its usual activity, but under the surface, an uneasy tension simmered. Word of the incident between Dr. Coleman and John Davis had spread quickly, carried in hushed whispers and exchanged glances. In the break room, two nurses sat quietly, their conversation barely above a murmur. "Did you see how he dismissed that man?" one of them, Laura, asked, her fingers nervously fiddling with a coffee stirrer. "He didn't even take a second to listen." Her colleague, Jenna, frowned but hesitated before responding. "It's not the first time," she finally said. "But what can we do? He's Dr. Coleman. If anyone speaks up, they'll pay for it." Laura's face hardened. "It's not right. That man could have needed urgent care." She glanced toward the door, lowering her voice even further. "I'm thinking about filing a report." Jenna looked alarmed. "Are you serious? He's practically untouchable. Do you want to lose your job?" Across the hall, other staff members were equally unsettled. A junior doctor leaned against the wall, arms crossed, as he talked with another nurse. "He's brilliant, sure," the doctor said, frustration lacing his voice. "But this isn't about skill. It's about basic decency. He gets away with it because no one challenges him," the nurse replied bitterly. "We all just let it slide." The tension wasn't confined to the break room. It seeped into the corridors, the exam rooms, even the cafeteria. Staff members stole glances at Richard, their expressions a mix of frustration and fear. For his part, Dr. Coleman seemed oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant. He carried on with his day, snapping orders and flipping through charts, his usual air of superiority intact. But not everyone could ignore the growing discomfort. Laura sat at her station, staring at the complaint form on her computer screen. Her cursor hovered over the submit button, her pulse quickening. She thought of John Davis, his calm demeanor, his quiet dignity. And then she thought of Dr. Coleman, his cold dismissal, and the ripple of unease it had left behind. With a sigh, she closed the tab. Not today, she whispered to herself, her voice tinged with guilt. The unspoken storm continued to brew. Dr. Coleman leaned against the counter in the staff lounge, sipping his coffee with the same detached confidence he carried throughout the day. His colleague, Dr. Patel, approached, flipping through a glossy magazine. "Interesting article here," Patel said casually, holding up the latest issue of Healthcare Leaders Monthly. They're profiling key figures in state healthcare. You know, the ones making real changes in policy. Richard barely glanced up. "And?" Patel smirked, tapping a photo on the page. "This guy looks familiar. Didn't I see him in the lobby earlier?" Richard frowned and finally looked. The page featured a full-color photo of John Davis, smiling in front of a podium. The headline read, "John Davis, Transforming Access and Equity in State Healthcare." "Unlikely," Richard scoffed, setting his coffee down. "Probably just someone who looks like him. That guy came in here looking for urgent care. No way he's the same person." Patel raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Says here he's the new head of state healthcare. You'd think someone with that title might stand out." Richard waved him off, irritation flickering across his face. "Doesn't matter. Whoever he is, he didn't belong here today. Probably some bureaucrat with a fancy title, nothing more." Patel chuckled, but his tone carried a note of curiosity. "If you say so, Richard. But seems like the kind of guy you'd want to know." "Just saying." Richard shook his head, dismissing the conversation entirely. But as Patel walked away, leaving the magazine on the counter, the camera of perception lingered on the open page. The audience sees what Richard doesn't. John Davis isn't just anyone. His poised demeanor earlier wasn't incidental, it came from a deep well of authority and accomplishment. While Richard dismisses him, the weight of John's status quietly looms, waiting to turn the tables. Dr. Coleman leaned against the counter in the staff lounge, sipping his coffee with the same detached confidence he carried throughout the day. His colleague, Dr. Patel, approached, flipping through a glossy magazine. "Interesting article here," Patel said casually, holding up the latest issue of Healthcare Leaders Monthly. "They're profiling key figures in state healthcare. You know, the ones making real changes in policy." Richard barely glanced up. "And?" Patel smirked, tapping a photo on the page. "This guy looks familiar. Didn't I see him in the lobby earlier?" Richard frowned and finally looked. The page featured a full-color photo of John Davis, smiling in front of a podium. The headline read, "John Davis, Transforming Access and Equity in State Healthcare." "Unlikely," Richard scoffed, setting his coffee down. "Probably just someone who looks like him. That guy came in here looking for urgent care. No way he's the same person." Patel raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Says here he's the new head of state healthcare. You'd think someone with that title might stand out." Richard waved him off, irritation flickering across his face. "Doesn't matter. Whoever he is, he didn't belong here today. Probably some bureaucrat with a fancy title, nothing more." Patel chuckled, but his tone carried a note of curiosity. "If you say so, Richard. But seems like the kind of guy you'd want to know." "Just saying." Richard shook his head, dismissing the conversation entirely. But as Patel walked away, leaving the magazine on the counter, the camera of perception lingered on the open page. The audience sees what Richard doesn't. John Davis isn't just anyone. His poised demeanor earlier wasn't incidental, it came from a deep well of authority and accomplishment. While Richard dismisses him, the weight of John's status quietly looms, waiting to turn the tables. The hospital bustled with preparations for the upcoming State Healthcare Conference, an event that promised to draw leaders and policymakers from across the region. Staff darted between departments, finalizing reports and presentations. The air hummed with a mix of nervous energy and anticipation. At the nurses' station, Laura glanced at the memo tacked to the wall. "All staff attending the conference must be punctual and in formal attire," it read. She exchanged a look with Jenna. "You think they'll actually announce something important this time?" Laura asked, trying to sound casual. Jenna shrugged. "Probably just another policy update. But I heard there's a guest speaker, a big name in healthcare. They've been keeping it under wraps." "Any idea who?" Laura pressed, her curiosity piqued. "No clue. But rumor has it, it's someone who's been shaking things up lately," Jenna replied, lowering her voice. "Maybe someone from the state office?" In the break room, Dr. Patel leaned against the counter, addressing a small group of junior staff. "Whoever this speaker is, they've got the board buzzing. Heard they've been championing equity in healthcare, which is rare for events like this." Across the hospital, Richard barely registered the chatter. He flipped through patient charts, focused on his own upcoming presentation. To him, the conference was just another opportunity to showcase his department's success. Guest speaker or not, he muttered to himself. They're here to see results, not hear buzzwords. Unseen to him, subtle hints of the speaker's identity emerged in quiet conversations and cryptic emails among senior staff. A nurse spotted a name she vaguely recognized on the attendee list but kept it to herself, uncertain. The stage was being set, and while many speculated, no one fully grasped the significance of what was about to unfold. The grand hall buzzed with excitement as healthcare professionals, hospital administrators, and policymakers gathered for the state healthcare conference. Rows of polished chairs filled quickly, the hum of conversations blending with the faint clinking of coffee cups from the refreshment tables. Large banners adorned the stage, proudly proclaiming state healthcare, advancing equity and excellence. Dr. Richard Coleman walked into the hall with the hospital delegation trailing behind him. His tailored suit was as sharp as his confidence. Clutching a sleek presentation folder, he was ready to showcase his department's success. "Today's about results," he said to a junior doctor beside him. "Let's make sure they remember who's setting the standard." Staff members nodded, but the atmosphere carried an undercurrent of tension. Whispers about the mysterious guest speaker rippled through the room. "Any idea who it is yet?" Laura asked Jenna, clutching her notepad tightly. Jenna shook her head. "Nothing confirmed. But they've got everyone guessing. Big shoes to fill, apparently." The murmur of voices quieted as the conference director stepped onto the stage. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice warm but commanding. "We're here to celebrate progress and confront challenges. And today, we're honored to have a very special guest, someone shaping the future of healthcare." Richard raised an eyebrow, only mildly interested. He leaned back in his chair, expecting the usual bureaucratic rhetoric. "And now," the director continued, "please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, a leader redefining healthcare equity. John Davis, head of state healthcare." The room fell silent. Whispers erupted as the poised figure of John Davis walked onto the stage. Richard froze, his grip tightening on the folder. A subtle shift of unease swept through the hospital delegation. The spotlight now belonged to the man Richard had dismissed just hours earlier. The applause began tentatively, a smattering of hesitant claps as John Davis stepped onto the stage. His presence was striking, calm, confident, and commanding. The tailored navy suit he wore under the bright stage lights seemed to amplify his aura of authority. "Good afternoon," John began, his deep, steady voice carrying effortlessly across the packed room. "It's an honor to stand before you today as we discuss the challenges and opportunities in transforming our healthcare system." From his seat near the center, Dr. Richard Coleman sat rigid, his mind racing. His eyes locked on John, disbelief washing over him like a wave. The man he had dismissed so curtly this morning was now standing at the podium, introduced as the head of state healthcare, a title that carried immense power and influence. Gasps rippled through the audience. Murmurs followed. "That's the guy from the lobby," a nurse whispered to her colleague, glancing nervously at Richard. "Did you see Richard's face?" Another whispered, her voice barely above a breath. On stage, John continued, unfazed by the buzz in the crowd. "Healthcare isn't just about treatment, it's about trust, equity, respect. These aren't just ideals, they're the foundation of care that every individual deserves." Richard's stomach churned. He gripped the edge of his chair, his thoughts a chaotic mess. How could he have been so blind? John's gaze scanned the room, and for the briefest moment, it lingered on Richard. The slightest pause, a fleeting acknowledgement, but enough to make Richard's chest tighten. As the applause grew louder, Richard sank into his seat, the weight of his earlier actions pressing down harder with each passing second. This wasn't just an important figure, this was the man who now held all the cards. John Davis stood tall behind the podium, his calm yet commanding presence silencing the murmurs that had erupted moments earlier. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces before him, his eyes scanning the room with quiet intensity. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and measured. "Today I stand before you not only as the head of state healthcare, but as someone who has seen the best and the worst of what our system can offer." The audience leaned in, captivated by the weight of his tone. "Healthcare," John continued, "is more than procedures and policies. It's a promise that every person, regardless of their background, will be treated with dignity, respect, and fairness. And yet, we've failed to uphold that promise far too often." He paused, letting the words settle. "I know this failure intimately, because I've lived it." The room grew quieter, the tension palpable. "When I was 12, John said, his voice tinged with emotion, "my mother was denied treatment for an illness that could have been easily managed. We didn't have the right insurance, and she didn't fit the mold of what some believed a worthy patient should look like. That decision, rooted in bias, cost her life." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Richard Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. "Unfortunately," John continued, his voice hardening, "this wasn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern, one that persists to this day. It's in the dismissive tones, the assumptions, and the reluctance to challenge prejudices, no matter how subtle they appear." He stepped away from the podium briefly, pacing as he spoke. "The truth is, systemic racism doesn't just exist in the shadows. It thrives in the silence of those who choose not to act. It lives in the culture of complicity, where speaking up feels too risky, too uncomfortable." Heads nodded across the room. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances. "Many of you have witnessed this," John said, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "Maybe you've looked away when a colleague dismissed a patient for reasons they wouldn't say aloud. Maybe you've convinced yourself it wasn't your place to interfere." His words struck a chord, the silence now heavy with reflection. "Today I ask you no. I implore you to confront this silence. Challenge the systems, the practices, and even the people who perpetuate these injustices. Because healthcare cannot thrive on skill alone. It requires courage, compassion, and accountability." The audience sat spellbound as John's voice softened, carrying the weight of his next words. "This morning I was reminded that even now, in positions of power, the color of my skin can still invite judgment, even in a space where equity should be unquestioned." Richard felt the eyes around him, but refused to meet them. His chest felt tight as John's words hung in the air. "We are better than this," John concluded, his tone rising with resolve. "Together we can ensure that no child loses their parent because of bias, that no patient fears seeking care, that no one is dismissed because of someone else's assumptions." He returned to the podium, gripping its edges as he delivered his final lines. "But it begins here, in rooms like this, with people like us. The question is, will we have the courage to rise to the challenge?" The room erupted into applause, though many clapped with dampened enthusiasm, lost in their own thoughts. For some, it was a moment of reckoning. For Richard, it was the beginning of an inescapable confrontation with himself. John stood at the podium, his voice calm but laced with purpose, as he transitioned into the final part of his speech. The room had fallen silent again, the applause fading into a heavy stillness. He let the quiet linger for a moment before speaking, each word deliberate. "This morning," he began, "I had the opportunity to experience, firsthand, what happens when we allow bias to cloud our judgment when the promise of healthcare as a right is undermined by personal assumptions." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Faces tensed, eyebrows furrowed. Some shifted in their seats, glancing toward one another. I arrived at a hospital, a well-respected one, to seek urgent care. My symptoms weren't severe, but they were enough to warrant attention. Yet before I could even explain my situation, I was dismissed, denied care. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Richard Coleman sat frozen in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He avoided looking up, but he could feel the heat of questioning eyes around him. "I'm not here to name names," John continued, his voice steady, "because this isn't about one person. It's about a culture. A culture that allows people to make decisions based on assumptions instead of facts. A culture where someone in need of help can be turned away, not because of their condition, but because of what they look like. The tension in the room grew thicker. Whispers turned into quiet gasps of realization. Richard clenched his jaw, his mind scrambling for excuses, explanations, anything to deflect the growing scrutiny. "I'm standing here today not because of anger," John said, his tone softening, "but because of a commitment to change. That moment reminded me why I do what I do, to ensure that bias and prejudice have no place in healthcare." A nurse near the back leaned toward her colleague, whispering, "Do you think he's talking about Dr. Coleman?" The colleague gave a hesitant nod, her eyes darting toward Richard. John closed his remarks with a subtle but piercing challenge. "The systems we operate in are shaped by us. If we don't challenge these biases, we enable them. And when we enable them, we fail everyone we serve." The room erupted into cautious applause, but Richard felt like every clap was a thunderous judgment. As the conference broke for a short recess, the room buzzed with hushed conversations. John Davis stepped down from the stage, heading toward the refreshment table. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, though he could feel the weight of the room's attention on him. "Mr. Davis?" A tentative voice called from behind. John turned to see a young nurse standing a few steps away, her hands nervously clutching the edges of her notepad. She looked as though she'd been debating whether to approach him. "Yes," he said, his tone warm, inviting her to speak. She took a deep breath, her voice shaking slightly. I wanted to thank you for what you said, and to apologize." John tilted his head slightly, waiting for her to continue. "I was there this morning," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the floor. "When you came into the hospital. I saw what happened, and I knew it was wrong. But I didn't say anything. I was scared of losing my job, of making things worse." John's expression softened. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Laura," she replied. "Laura," he said, his voice steady. "Thank you for telling me this. It takes courage to recognize when something's wrong, and even more to speak up about it." Her eyes welled up, but she smiled faintly. I hope I can do better next time." "You will," John assured her. "Change starts with moments like this." Laura nodded, her shoulders relaxing. "Thank you for standing up today. It means more than you know." As she walked away, John watched her go, hopeful that small steps like these could spark the larger changes he was fighting for. The air in the conference hall had shifted, the once buzzing atmosphere now heavy with tension. As the break ended, attendees filed back into their seats. But the murmurs hadn't stopped. Dr. Richard Coleman could feel the weight of eyes on him, each glance sharper than the last. At first, Richard tried to ignore it, keeping his gaze fixed on the front of the room as the next speaker took the stage. But the whispers grew louder, turning into pointed exchanges. "I can't believe it was him," a nurse muttered to her colleague. "You saw how he looked when John spoke," another attendee said, just loud enough for Richard to hear. Richard's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the armrest of his chair. Finally, one of the hospital board members, seated a few rows ahead, turned around to face him directly. "Dr. Coleman," she said, her tone cool and precise, "a number of us have questions about this morning. Would you care to clarify?" Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. "Is it true?" Another voice chimed in, this time from a colleague. "Did you really deny care to the state's head of healthcare, based on assumptions?" He stumbled for a response, his usual confidence gone. I didn't know who he was," Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "That's not the point," the board member interjected sharply. "Your job is to treat patients with dignity, no matter who they are. You've compromised this hospital's reputation, and worse, you've compromised our principles." As murmurs of agreement swept through the room, Richard's face flushed. He attempted to regain composure, but the damage was done. By the time the conference adjourned for lunch, the decision was swift. The hospital board gathered briefly, their verdict unanimous. A senior administrator approached Richard, his expression grim. "Dr. Coleman, you're being suspended pending a full investigation. Hand over your badge and access cards immediately." Richard froze, his hands trembling. The words hit like a blow, each syllable stripping away the authority he had wielded for so long. As he exited the hall under the gaze of his peers, his once commanding presence had crumbled into a shadow of itself. The whispers didn't stop, and for the first time, Richard realized they were right. Richard Coleman walked out of the conference hall with his head lowered, the quiet murmurs of his colleagues following him like a shadow. He clutched his briefcase tightly, his shoulders slumped under the weight of humiliation. The once confident doctor, known for his skill and authority, now seemed like a defeated figure. In the hallway, a nurse whispered to her colleague, "Did you hear?" The board suspended him. "He deserves it," the other replied, though her tone carried a hint of pity. As Richard disappeared down the corridor, the hospital's leadership wasted no time addressing the fallout. A press release was drafted within hours, acknowledging the incident and committing to immediate reforms. "We are implementing mandatory training on implicit bias and patient equity for all staff," the statement read. "Additionally, we are establishing an anonymous reporting system to ensure accountability at every level." Back inside the conference, John Davis declined to comment on Richard's suspension when asked by a journalist. Instead, he redirected the conversation. "This isn't about one person's actions," John said firmly. "It's about creating a system where such actions aren't tolerated in the first place. Accountability is necessary, but so is change. That's where our focus must be." He was equally measured when the hospital's board approached him, expressing regret and asking if he intended to pursue legal action. "No," John replied calmly. "What matters most is ensuring this doesn't happen again to anyone. Use this moment to lead, to educate, to reform." His words left an indelible mark on everyone present. By choosing systemic improvement over personal retribution, John shifted the narrative from blame to progress. The hospital's reforms moved swiftly, but the memory of that day lingered, a stark reminder of the cost of prejudice and the power of accountability. John Davis sat at the long mahogany table in the hospital boardroom, his calm demeanor commanding the attention of everyone present. Across from him, the hospital's senior leadership sat stiffly, some avoiding his gaze while others wore expressions of quiet contrition. The room was heavy with the weight of recent events. "I appreciate you making time for this discussion," John began, his tone measured but firm. "It's important that we address not just what happened, but why it happened." A board member cleared her throat, her voice hesitant. "Mr. Davis, we deeply regret the incident this morning. Dr. Coleman's behavior does not reflect our values." John held up a hand gently, stopping her. "I understand that you're focused on addressing this specific situation, but this is bigger than one person. The issue isn't just Dr. Coleman's actions, it's the culture that allowed it to happen." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. "Bias in healthcare isn't always loud or obvious," John continued, leaning slightly forward. "Often, it's subtle. It lives in the assumptions we make, in the way we treat some patients differently than others. And when that bias goes unchecked, it undermines everything we stand for." The room remained silent as John's words sank in. "I've reviewed your current policies," he said, gesturing to a folder in front of him. "You have procedures in place, but they lack enforcement. Training programs exist, but they don't reach the deeper, systemic issues. You need more than words on paper. You need action." A senior administrator nodded. "What do you suggest, Mr. Davis?" "Start by making equity a cornerstone of your practice," John replied. "Implement ongoing, mandatory training on implicit bias and cultural competency, not just once a year, but regularly. Create safe channels for staff to report discrimination without fear of retaliation." He paused, letting the weight of his proposal sink in. "And most importantly, lead by example. Change starts at the top. If your leadership doesn't embody these principles, neither will your staff." The board members nodded slowly, their expressions a mix of guilt and determination. "We'll begin immediately," the chairwoman said. John leaned back, his voice calm yet resolute. "Good, because lives depend on it." As the conference wound down, John Davis stepped outside into the crisp evening air, his thoughts heavy but focused. The day's events had been a stark reminder of the challenges still embedded within the healthcare system. Yet, amidst the frustration, there was hope, a belief that even small moments of accountability could spark larger change. Injustice, John thought, thrives in silence. He had seen it his entire life, from his mother's denial of care to the countless stories patients shared with him over the years. Turning away, pretending not to see, had always been the easier path. But it was also the most dangerous. His mind returned to the nurse who had approached him during the break, a quiet apology still fresh in his memory. It wasn't just about her silence, it was about the system that made speaking up feel like a risk. Addressing a small group of attendees lingering near the conference doors, John spoke with quiet conviction. "We all have moments when we see something wrong. The question is, will we act? Will we challenge the status quo, even when it's uncomfortable? Or will we look the other way?" He paused, his gaze steady. "Change doesn't happen in a vacuum. It takes courage, and it starts with us." The dim glow of the hospital corridor reflected off the polished metal nameplate that read Dr. Richard Coleman. A custodian carefully unscrewed it from the office door, placing it into a box marked Personnel Records. The sound of the screwdriver turning echoed faintly, each twist a quiet symbol of change. Nearby, a junior nurse paused, watching the nameplate's removal. For months, it had been a fixture of authority, a reminder of Richard's untouchable status. Now, it was gone, leaving behind only the faint outline of where it had been. Meanwhile, back at the conference hall, the closing session was coming to a crescendo. John Davis stood at the center of the stage, his final remarks resonating deeply with the audience. "Today is not just about what went wrong," he said, his voice steady. "It's about what we can do to make it right. Equity is not a distant ideal, it's a responsibility we all share." The audience, moved by his words and his unwavering resolve, rose to their feet in applause. The sound grew louder, a powerful wave of recognition and respect. As John stepped down from the stage, a faint smile crossed his face. Change had begun not just in policies, but in hearts and minds.